We are all standing here, Republicans in the state legislature, business leaders throughout the state of Connecticut, today to talk in opposition of Senate Bill 249, which is an act promoting retirement savings. I'm going to make my remarks very brief, and then we're going to hear from some other folks, both in the legislature and people who are working every day in the real world to create jobs and help others save for their retirement. So I'm going to be brief. But this is yet another example where the Democrats in the building believe that government is the sole person or entity responsible for running every aspect of our lives, and that the private sector isn't working. We've heard that in healthcare. We've heard that in a number of fields. And it's just not the right way our state needs to be going. The reality is that the private market makes products available to help people invest and make savings for their retirements. They've been doing it well for a very long time. They can do it better than the government can do it. And if this bill were to pass, we will see job losses in the private sector, and we will see quite frankly, over the long term, the government produce a product that is far inferior than the one that the private market is already producing. There are a lot of things that are wrong with this bill specifically, which some of my colleagues will talk about, from the opt-out provisions and the other types of things. But as a big picture matter, this is about whether or not we believe government should run every aspect of our lives, or whether we trust hardworking individuals to create jobs and produce jobs in the private sector who can provide those investment services. That's really it. Should government be doing it, or should the private sector be doing it? We fall clearly on the side that the private sector has shown that it can do it, is doing it, and will continue to do it far better than the government ever can or will. With that, I want to turn it over to Senator Fasano, who's going to talk a little bit about the fact that this concept in and of itself is probably not allowed under existing federal ERISA laws. Senator Fasano.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Sort of the driest aspect of this is the issue of ERISA rules and the obligations. And the real question here is whether or not ERISA would apply or not. And if it does, it certainly jeopardizes the other pension plans and adds certain liabilities the state's unwilling to take. And all you have to do is look, this bill has been around for 3 years in some form or another. And as we sit here today, there's still not an opinion from the state on that issue, nor has anybody sought an opinion from the state on that issue. So you have to kind of look around and say, well, where has this popped up? And in California is where it's popped up. California did pass a bill very similar to this, and then quickly said, well, wait a minute, before we implement it, we need to find out what the ERISA implications are. And oh, by the way, when we do, we should go back to the legislature with those findings so that we're making sure we're doing the right thing. So no state has really done this. I understand, I heard this morning, perhaps Massachusetts might have passed something similar, but I don't have any other information on it. But I do know in California, it's a real issue. See, what ERISA is a protection. That's why we did ERISA federally. It is to protect those who are investing with rules and guidelines to make sure that your investments fall under certain protections. It's a consumer protection bill. And what this seeks to do is say, well, we're going to forget about that. And we're not going to look at that. So if we do it, we're going to ignore the very protection, the reason why we have the ERISA laws, which seems to be in conflict with arguing that this bill is going to protect those people who want to have their money in a retirement system and it is safe. So that conflict of policy is very troubling to me. But more importantly, whether we could even do this from the get-go needs to be answered. That is the most important part. Can this bill be legal? That needs to be answered before we go forward, before we start $2 to $8 million of putting a plan together, which may be for naught if, in fact, this plan is illegal. So that's my portion of it, and I'll turn it back over to Senator McKinney.
Thank you. Now, Senator Markley, the ranking member of the Labor Committee, is going to come and discuss aspects of the bill. Joe, thank you.
Thank you, John. Yes, I'm ranking member along with Representative Smith of the Labor Committee, and let me say, the Labor Committee is an interesting committee. We see some ideas that I think are not particularly strong, and they tend to come out of the committee anyways. And this was one of them, a program that I think with the best intentions has not been thoroughly thought through. And I have to say, I kind of assumed that it was going to fall by the wayside somewhere in the legislative process because of the problems that, to my mind, were very clear in it. But I've become concerned that it may develop a momentum of its own, and I think the people of Connecticut need to know what they might be getting into if this bill goes forward. Let me say there's, to my mind, three things about this bill that bother me particularly, and Senator McKinney's touched on them to some extent. The first one is the idea that the government would force people into a retirement plan, whether they want it or not. I think we all agree that it's important for people to save for their retirement. That certainly is the motivation behind many of the groups which are supporting this legislation, to find a way to guarantee people's retirement. But you have to ask yourself if you believe it's the role of state government to actually take money out of people's pay unless they opt out to make that happen. I don't believe it. I think there's other ways to approach it. The second thing is that we have the state setting itself up as a competitor to existing financial institutions which are eager to provide that service. I've got Mike Leone here from Southington, a constituent of mine with Leone Financial Services. His life's work is to help people save for their retirement. Why should government be in competition with him? And the third reason I'd suggest is that it opens the government up to an obligation that they may not be in a position to perform. According to this, there's going to be a board set up which would determine what the rate of return for investors in this fund were. And to my mind, with very dubious reasoning, the bill holds that the state would buy an insurance plan to make sure they got the rate of return that's involved. Such an insurance plan simply doesn't exist. I don't believe it ever could exist. I am fear that the state may take on an obligation which political pressure would force us to pay money out of the general fund for. And I'd further say that it concerns me always to have the state have an enormous fund like a retirement fund under state control, given the state's willingness to reach into those funds in tight financial times. I think it's a very poorly thought out proposal, and I would think it would be potentially a disaster for the state if this were to pass in the next 2 weeks, and I really think people ought to know about it and be aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next, for some brief comments, is Senator Tony Boucher.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here with us, and we're so pleased to be joined by many of the individuals that work in this industry that are directly affected by this. I'm happy that Hope Feller is here from the town of Westport that works in this industry along with many others, and joined by my ranking member on the Finance Committee. Both Senator Scott Franz and I actually work in the industry to some extent and have some knowledge about this. This is a very far-reaching proposal, one of the few, if any, in the entire country. In places where it has been tested, it is not in practice right now because of so many issues, and it also could be potentially harmful to a person's financial security. We know that this is going to be set up much like the trust as Social Security. And there's no question that we already know that we have trouble with our own pension fund that is underfunded at 50%. Under this bill, which is a great concern to me, the Treasurer must procure financial insurance that the individual would deem necessary to protect the retirement fund. However, it's not clear what would happen if the Treasurer does not deem this insurance necessary and if promised retirement account payments exceed available funds. In addition to this, the fact that they are promising a guaranteed rate of return for plan participants is very problematic. In volatile markets, no one could actually logically could make such a commitment. And in fact, something called portfolio insurance is extremely expensive, rarely used, has been found to not work well, and in fact is basically putting in a CD type of account that very few take advantage of. Again, because the cost is so prohibitive, it actually decreases the actual return that you might want to get out of your plan. In addition, it is very clear, and this is why we want to have the individuals most affected by this, it really does compete with private business, and it raises the question of what should the state of Connecticut be in the business of providing? What is his core responsibility? And many of us here would maintain that it is not to be in the business of business itself. That should be left to the private sector. We need to return power back to the marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And before just next person, I did not introduce, because we've been joined by a number of members of the House Republican Caucus, Representative Sampson, Representative Smith, who I believe is the ranking member of the Labor Committee as well, Representative Lavielle, who has written and talked about this issue, and Representative Vin Candelora. So this is, well, yeah, I was introducing members of the House because you've only heard from senators, and this is obviously something that House Republicans and Senate Republicans are working on together. So I'd like Representative Vin Candelora to come up and speak, and then we want you to hear from people who are doing this in the real world.
Thank you, Senator. On behalf of the House Republicans, it gives me pleasure to be here and stand in solidarity on this issue. We've seen this movie play out before, and that was with the pooling of our health care bill that repeatedly came up year after year after year. Despite the fact that the Attorney General back then, currently Senator Blumenthal, had indicated that this possibly would jeopardize the government's plan, their exemption under ERISA, which would have major financial implications to the state of Connecticut. Similarly, now we're dealt with this same issue. Frankly, I think it's a piece of legislation that we are pandering to the low-income earners at the expense of their own paychecks. These individuals would be required to put 5% into a pension plan that they might not even be able to afford to begin with. And on top of that, this plan would not have the protections, as Senator Fasano pointed out, of our federal ERISA laws, which are there to protect these individuals. And finally, I think, given these facts, we certainly, at the very least, should study this issue, take some time to make sure that we do it right, because if we're in violation of federal law, we could never take that back. We would jeopardize the plan, and we could jeopardize the entire state pension plan. So I would highly recommend, at the very least, that we do is to make a study of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are joined today by a number of financial advisors who do this every day for a living, and I'll introduce them. Hope Feller, who was introduced already from Westport, Connecticut, Mike Leone from Southington, Catherine Ernstke, who's from Danbury, and John Sayer, who I'm going to have come up and speak to you from my hometown of Fairfield. We also have Joe Brennan with the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, letters from NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And just when I asked John to come up, John, why don't you come up here? Just people have talked about protections and what happens in the private market. Let me just give you one example. In the private market, you will have a clause in your plan that allows you, under certain circumstances, to stop making any investments if your circumstances change. So, for example, you're employed in a small business and your hours have been significantly reduced, so therefore your pay is significantly reduced. You can, because you now don't have that 5% extra to put into a retirement plan, keep that money so you can pay your mortgage and pay your bills. Under the bill that the state proposes, the Democrats have proposed, you cannot do that. You cannot do that. You'll be forced to continue to pay that 5% for an entire year before you have the option to change your circumstances. Or if you're a dual income family and your spouse loses their job, so your family income maybe is cut in half, you're still forced to pay the 5% to the state plan, when in the private market you can get out because you need that money, again, to pay your bills, to pay your rent, to pay your mortgage. That's a real-world example of how the private market works better than the government can, and how the proposal put forward can actually hurt real working men and women across the state of Connecticut. So I want John Sayer to come up and speak to you about why this is not a good idea and how people and retirement...
...be my name. The reason I'm here is twofold. One, I have been in the business 29 years. A good portion of my income comes from the 401k market. I'm not as worried about my job as some people would like me to feel, but what I am concerned with is that as a participant, if I were to be a participant in this, one, I think that I've been told that the reason the state wants to do this is because people like John Sayor and Big John are not in the market helping me. I would like you to know that just recently I spent a lot of time with the young people. I teach at Sacred Heart University as an adjunct. I talked to them about saving, and I spoke to an 18-year-old recently who I convinced to start putting away $86.72 per month so that he could start building a retirement account, much the same as we would like this to be done with the low-income private sector workers. I will tell you that I'm in the field, and so many of us are in the field doing this, regardless of what kind of commissions that it presents to us. And the reason we are is because there is no getting around the fact that we have many people who have not saved enough already and who are facing retirement and who are not in a position to be able to be as fortunate maybe as I am. I'm 72. I work. I have three different businesses that I have and from which I earn income. But not everybody is in that position. And so it is true that we need to do something. My position is that we need to educate the young. Very hard, very difficult at this point to try to help anyone who's 55 or 60 years old to save for retirement. So this bill isn't geared for them. The bill is geared for someone in their 20s or 30s. But that person earning those kind of dollars that we're talking about has very little to incentivize him to do this. He needs to be educated. He needs someone on the ground to teach him and show him why it's important, what the magic of compound interest is. I think that's crucial. But in looking at the bill, to be honest with you, what scares the heck out of me is we are told this bill is designed to help the low-income private sector worker who's going to put 2% of his $35,000 or $40,000 in. That's $800 max a year. But the bill may cost the state to set up somewhere between $2 to $8 million. I don't know the cost, but it's been estimated at that range. If we have that cost, how many of these people do have to put their $800 per year away in order to pay back the state for its outlay? Or who else is going to lay out those dollars? So that means it's on the back of the participant. How are we helping him, and how can we promise him a rate of return, especially in the early years? And this is what I say as a participant, if I were that person, how am I going to get my rate of return that you promise me, which must be done by design of the bill in December of the year prior to the return, and it must be determined by the treasurer based on what he thinks he's going to earn in the coming year. That's the way the bill is written. So how am I going to get protected and get my rate of return if those dollars in the first early years have to be paid back to the state for its outlay starting the bill? That to me is really something that's not been answered by the bill nor answered by the proponents. Secondly, I don't understand that the proponents haven't been able to define who the low-income private sector worker is. Is it somebody making $70,000 who has 4 children and he's a single parent? Is it the startup young boy that I was talking to who makes $10,000 and was willing to put away $80 a month or $86 and change a month? Who is that person? I think we need to define that. Because state of Connecticut, it costs an awful lot to live in the state of Connecticut, as we all know. I have other complaints about the bill, but I think if I take up all your time, it's not appropriate.
Great. Thank you. Let me introduce the last person to speak, Hope Feller from Westport. Okay. Hope, why don't you go?
Hi, my name is Hope Feller from Westport, Connecticut. I'm a constituent of Tony Boucher's, working in the financial planning and insurance industry. In the time allotted, I just don't want to belabor the point of what has already been said. The difference, what is already available to the employee as a vehicle to save for retirement savings, is that right now, for a sum of $50 per year at banks and financial institutions, these employees in question can open an IRA using payroll deductions from his employer. The employer has zero cost and zero fiduciary responsibilities. With this bill, the layer of paid professionals hired to create the retirement plan will be on the backs of the low-income participants, inflating the $50 that's available now to an estimated by the state controller to be an estimated $2 to $10 million as a startup cost. Does this make sense? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take questions, but let me just end by repeating what Hope just said. Right now, for $50 a year, you can go in to a financial institution or bank and open up an IRA, an individual retirement account, with a payroll deduction that costs you nothing and costs your employer nothing. That is evidence that the proponents of this bill cannot overcome, that the availability for people to go get retirement accounts is there, and the private sector is meeting the need. What the proponents of this bill do not want to talk about, which is the elephant in the room, is that while the availability of retirement accounts are there, the ability is not. People are working harder for less. They don't have that extra 2 to 5% to put away and save for their retirement, which everybody, proponents and opponents of this bill, wish they had. We disagree a lot in this building of how we can solve that. From my perspective, constantly increasing taxes and taking more money out of the pockets of hardworking people is one of the main reasons why they do not have that ability to save for their retirement accounts, even though the availability of having one is there. That's the real issue that we need to be resolving. I know there are people who support this bill. I would love to have their support on some other reforms, like how a man can work for 3 days as a judge and earn $100,000 a year when people are struggling to save for their retirement. But that's a discussion for another day. So why don't we open it up to questions?